I want to make you a promise. It's serious to me and I intend to keep it. I'm going to permanently change the way you think about composure, not just refine it and not supplement it. I'm going to attempt to fully change it at the root. The first thing I want to talk to you about is the problem with defining composure. Let's start with an admission that a clean definition of composure in its truest sense is impossible. The physicist and philosopher Fabricio Fagan, who, among other things, designed the first commercial microprocessor and then basically spent the second half of his career wondering why he felt so empty after doing that. Certain things in human experience are what he called irreducible. Essentially, what it means is they cannot be fully captured in objective third-party language without losing the very essence of what they are. And consciousness, I want you to understand, is one of those things. Love is another, and composure, real composure, the lived experience of it, belongs in that same category as well. You can write a dictionary kind of definition of composure if you want to. We could maybe call it a state of calm self-assurance, which is technically accurate, but at its core is completely useless because that definition doesn't tell you what it feels like to be in the presence of a composed person. It doesn't explain why some people walk into a room and the room just changes, while others walk into the same room and nothing happens at all. And it really doesn't capture why do we instinctively trust certain people and not others long before they've said anything that we could logically kind of evaluate. So instead of a definition, I want to offer you a portrait, and I'm going to ask you to notice what you feel. Marcus Aurelius, who during his adult life was the most powerful man in the Roman Empire at that time, in his book Meditations, he described a man named Maximus. Maximus was a Roman senator and consul in 144 AD. He was a Stoic philosopher, and he served as a teacher and mentor to Marcus Aurelius during his formative years. And here's what Marcus Aurelius wrote about Maximus. From Maximus, I learned self-government and not to be led aside by anything, and cheerfulness in all circumstances, as well as in illness, and not just admixture in the moral character of sweetness and dignity, and to do what was set before me without complaining. I observed that everybody believed that he thought as he spoke, and that in all that he did, he never had any bad intention, and he never showed amazement and surprise, and was never in a hurry, nor was he perplexed nor dejected, free from all falsehood, and he presented the appearance of a man who could not be diverted from right. So tell me what's missing from that portrait. There's no performance, there's no theater. The man simply was what he was. In every room, in every circumstance. He didn't inflate in victory. He didn't shrink in difficulty. And he was anchored to something that the outside world had no lever to move. That is composure. And notice it is not described as a technique. It is described as a character. Maximus didn't just perform composure. He was too busy simply being to perform anything. Now let's talk about where most people actually live. Picture a pendulum, and on the far left, we have collapse, and on the far right, we have posturing. And at rest, hanging out in the center, is composure. Most people spend the large majority of their time somewhere pretty far out on that arc. They're not in stillness and motion. They're reacting to the last thing that happened. Maybe they're compensating for the fear of the thing that they're expecting to happen, or adjusting the presentation of themselves in real time based on what they believe the room wants from them. Let's look at collapse. Collapse essentially is the tendency to shrink, to maybe fold yourself smaller in order to make other people comfortable, to avoid conflict in order to be liked. The collapsed person is often going to volunteer even when it's not in their best interests. You'll see them apologize before anyone has even accused them of doing anything. They'll overgive, whether it's time, energy, money, patience. And this is not because they're some kind of a saint. It's because they've learned somewhere along the line of their life that their needs are a burden. In my mind, that is the heart of collapse. Underneath what we can look at from the outside, like the extraordinary generosity or the selflessness, there's a hidden shame, just like we just talked about, a quiet, persistent belief that this person is not quite enough the way they are. That if they stop giving, if they stop accommodating, stop shrinking, people are finally going to see the truth of them and that they'll find it disappointing. Collapse seeks energy from others. It requires the steady supply of approval from everyone around them just in order to keep functioning. This is why people living deeply in collapse are kind of exhausting to be around. And then we see posturing, right, which is at the other end of this arc. Posturing is the one that everybody can see. Most people are not consciously aware of how much they might be posturing or collapsing. They believe that they're in composure. The posturing person needs to be seen as powerful. They want to be seen as successful, someone who commands respect, and someone who has already arrived somewhere that most people are still trying to get to. There's a separation. And this desperation, just to be perceived a certain way, it essentially creates a brittle kind of existence because the entire architecture of their whole self-worth depends on the external world cooperating with their preferred narrative. Normally, in the quiet dark of 3 a.m. when they're sitting all by themselves, they always wonder if they are real because they've been performing for so long that they start to lose track of where that performance ends and where the real them begins. Collapse and posturing are not opposites. They're the same disease, basically wearing different clothes. Both are trying to extract a thing from other people around them, whether it's respect, love, validation, admiration, safety. Both are operating from a concealed agenda, and both are rooted in insecurity. One response on one side of it is to make yourself smaller so no one can see how much you want. And the other is basically to make yourself bigger so no one can see exactly how afraid you are. The path to composure is not across the pendulum, it's perpendicular to it. It requires stopping the swing altogether. We live in a culture that has become deeply suspicious of the subjective. We want data, we want metrics, we want things that we can kind of measure and track on a graph. And that instinct is not wrong, right? Measurement is a genuinely useful tool, but it becomes dangerous when we apply it to things that are fundamentally irreducible. When we try to fully capture the living experience of composure inside of some kind of cold clinical framework, we end up with something technically correct, but humanly hollow. With something like composure, I think the best thing we can do is probably something like what artists do. We can attempt to represent it. We can hold it up from different angles. A great painter doesn't show you love. They show you something that produces love in the viewer. And that, at the end of the day, is the standard I'm aiming for with you. Now we get into what we might kind of call the engine room. If you want to understand what composure looks like, we need to understand what it generates and what generates the conditions that precipitate the ability for composure to arise. What we want to solve is what makes composure possible. It is not a gift that some people are born with and others are simply not. It is a state that emerges from a set of very specific conditions. And these conditions can be changed. Behavior is not fixed, and states are not permanent. First one here is confidence. Confidence, for many people, is one of the most understood words in the whole kind of industry of personal development or self-mastery, whatever word you want to give it. Confidence is not the feeling when you've been validated by enough people. That's approval, and it's coming from a place of insecurity. The best definition of confidence that I have ever heard is from Chase. Chase said that it's a feeling of safety and a generalized expectation of positive outcomes occurring in the future. The more confidence you have, the easier composure is going to be to experience. Next, let's look at gratitude. True gratitude, it's not some kind of a performance. There is a particular kind of person who has a genuinely good things in their life and they just cannot see them. They're basically too focused on things that they haven't earned yet. They're always looking at the distances they haven't covered. And this chronic forward fixation at the end of the day is what creates a background static of this feeling of insufficiency that makes composure almost impossible. Composure requires, at a minimum, the ability to be here, to be fully present without the present moment feeling like it is some kind of a failure state. Gratitude comes from is a direction of attention. It's a practiced choice to see what is actually around you rather than only what is missing. And when that practice becomes habitual, something deep happens. The feeling of urgency finally drops, and the need for the external world to perform to your very specific individual specifications can begin to soften. Next one is time. Ask yourself this: how much of your day did you actually choose? And how much of it was just chosen for you? Here is something that I have observed constantly in people who struggle with composure. Their days are going to be stacked with different obligations that accumulated without their intention. They are filled to the brim normally with commitments that are made to avoid disappointing someone else. They basically move through the day reacting to the next email, the next request, the next fire. And by the end of it, they have worked hard, they're exhausted, that none of it was really theirs. And finally, what most affects composure is environment. Your immediate environment either builds your composure or it's going to tax it. The people you spend the most time with, the spaces you inhabit, are all going to affect the quality of input that your nervous system receives on a daily basis. All of it either serving your development or it's going to kind of start to erode it. Be honest what your environment is doing to you. Try to edit what can be edited, exit the things that need to be exited. And if neither of those things are currently possible because of whatever circumstances you may be going through in your life, then you need to acknowledge the tax that you're paying and be willing to compensate for that accordingly. Everything that I just described, whether it was confidence, gratitude, time, environment, these are the supports. They're the scaffolding. There's people who have had their careers stripped away, their reputations destroyed, freedom completely gone, relationships almost non-existent, and yet they are still composed. These people are anchored to something that the outside world simply just does not have access to. The long, humbling, most likely lifelong goal is to develop so thoroughly inward that external conditions become genuinely secondary. They will never be irrelevant, but we can make them secondary. Now we arrive at what I consider the most important point of this entire lecture. The number one intangible precursor to composure, the deepest and the most fundamental condition from which a composed state can emerge. The understanding that your consciousness is separate from your ego. You are not fundamentally special, not in your suffering, not in your accomplishments, and definitely not your struggles, your gifts, your journey, or even your pain. The ego, upon hearing that sentence, will very likely have immediately begun drafting its rebuttal. It may be saying something like, I am special, or that my suffering has been particularly hard. My victories are very incredibly earned, more than anyone else's. And normally it will do this pretty quickly. It's almost kind of an automatic response with typically a fairly convincing amount of emotional weight behind it. The strength of resistance is typically going to be proportional to the strength of your belief. And the strength of your belief is proportional to how much it's running your behavior without even being consciously aware of it. When we allow ourselves to conflate our ego with our actual self, every single interaction starts to become load bearing. Every conversation that we have almost functions as a structural kind of test. And every perceived slight becomes a threat to our edifice that we've created. Every disagreement starts to become an attack, not just on our ideas, but on us as a human being. And because of the ego we've built, we cannot afford to lose when we're in this state. Because what would losing mean, right? Losing would mean the collapse of something we've identified as the self. It would mean death. Essentially, we have only two moves available to us. We can either fight to defend it, or we can decide to fall into collapse. You are not your career. You are not the sum of your accomplishments, not your reputation, not your failures. It doesn't have anything to do with your social standing or maybe the opinion that your father had of you. All of these are events that occurred near your consciousness. They occurred in proximity, but your consciousness that witnessed them, it's something that's quiet, it's aware underneath all of the rest of the noise of your life. And it doesn't need any of those things in order to truly be okay. This idea we see appear in basically every philosophical and spiritual tradition. We saw the Stoics call it the distraction between the hegemonikon, the rational, essentially governing self, and the impressions and opinions and the desires that sort of buffer it from the outside. And the Buddhists called it the difference between awareness and body. In modern neuroscience, we see people call it the difference between the default mode network and maybe the pure limbic experience. There's one thing, though, that everybody agrees on, that there is something that is not your ego. Real composure has nothing to prove. It doesn't have anything to even protect. It just is. This is why Aurelius could walk down the halls of an empire in a state of genuine chaos, and he could do it in peace. It wasn't because his circumstances were easy. They definitely weren't. He 100% had not. He had done through years of daily philosophical practice. He had learned to locate himself somewhere deep inside of him, something that was other than his ego. And from that location, composure wasn't some kind of a struggle or a daily battle that he incurred. It was simply who he was and the state that he embodied every day. When you believe that you are fundamentally special in your accomplishments, what happens is you develop a chronic kind of low-grade anxiety that the specialness won't be recognized by others, and that the distance between your internal sense of worth, external acknowledgement that you might get from others, is just going to always be this massive chasm. So this produces posturing, right? The constant effort to close that gap by trying to almost project a version of yourself that demands some type of recognition from the world around it. When you believe that you are fundamentally special in your suffering, you develop an equally corrosive pattern, right? It's the same thing here. We're always seeing this duality where these two things are very similar. They're just operating at opposite ends of the spectrum, but those opposite ends almost meet each other in most ways. And when we believe we're special in our suffering, your pain is now able to become your identity. Your hardship starts to become your kind of central credential. And unconsciously or not, you're going to begin to protect that, because the idea that starts to emerge is that without it, who am I? What is my story? For most people, I think this produces a kind of particular flavor, we could call it, of collapse, where a person gives and they give and they give, and they make sure that you know exactly how much that it's costing them. Whether it's the specialness of achievement or the specialness of suffering, probably pretty obvious now. These are both traps. And essentially, the same key is going to unlock both of them. What is that key? The key is the genuine embodied understanding that you are one conscious being among millions of conscious beings, all of whom are very likely just as equally baffled and frightened and hopeful and capable of love and all the other things. You are not the main character of the universe. You might be the main character of your story, and you are a character. You are valuable, and there are some aspects of you that are irreplaceable, but you're not the main one. The story of the universe is fundamentally bigger than you are. It's not meant to be humiliating. It's something that is liberating. Because when you finally stop needing to be the most important thing in every room, that's when you can finally relax into just being in the room. And when the real you is just in the room, you become the most interesting person there. And that is the paradox of composure. You've probably heard Chase talk about that many times before as well. Focusing on the things that are in our control versus the things that aren't is one of the biggest things that can help to setting us free from that anxiety. Here's a quote from Marcus Aurelius. Be content with what you are, and wish not to change, nor dread your last day, nor long for it. Most people who are in a state of posturing or collapse do not realize it at that time. The reason is that they conflate their perception of external reality with what they perceive to be the objective truth of their internal experience of it. The person who is yelling in a situation, if they genuinely believe that the situation demands it, or the person maybe who's over apologizing that genuinely believes the situation actually requires this, neither of those people are to them wrong, and they're not lying. What's going on is that they can't see the gaps between what is happening outside of them and how that they are responding to it. Because essentially they have never been shown where to look. They've learned to experience their emotional reactions as facts about the external world rather than as information about their internal state. So both of these people are sincere. Both of them are wrong, but neither of them can change what they can't see first. The first practice is to develop the habit of observing yourself from a slight distance, not with some kind of harsh judgment. If you're looking at yourself through poisoned judgment of you, that judgment is the enemy of honest self-observation. Because if we're judging ourselves in a shameful kind of way, most of the time it's going to cause us to flinch away from what we see. What I want you to do for this step is at the end of each day, just sit down for maybe 5 minutes and replay the significant interactions of your day, almost as if you were watching footage of somebody else. So you're not trying to evaluate your morality. All you want to do is just see, was I composed? Was I drifting towards collapse? Or was I drifting towards posturing? Where on this pendulum was I spending most of my time today? And what were the conditions, relationships, situations that precipitated that? If you do this consistently, it will begin to produce a kind of internal calibration that will absolutely change your behavior in real time. Because once you've seen clearly enough times, that's when you can finally start to feel the drift before it completes and before that pendulum fully swings. And in that space of realization is where your autonomous free will and choice lives. And that's where the change begins to occur. Tool number 2. This is about competitive frames versus collaborative frames. A competitive frame is fundamentally incompatible with a composed state, and I will prove to you why. It means that you are organizing your experience of the world around you in a state of comparison. You're either above or below, you're ahead or behind, you're more maybe, or you're less. You could be winning, you could be losing. If you are always in competition, then what? You will always be somewhere on that arc. It is fundamental to the frame that you're going to be posturing when you're ahead, you're going to be collapsing when you're behind, and very likely you will be cycling between the two as your circumstances change. If we talk about real excellence, real deep, lasting excellence, from my experience, that comes from a different source entirely. It comes from a person who is measuring themselves against their own potential, against their own values, and not the performance of someone else. This is a lesson that I have certainly learned the hard way, and I'm a human, I'm not perfect, but the more that I can always remember this is such a critical life skill and so central to just success and feeling good and having strong relationships, let alone composure. You do not need to win the room. You need to enlarge the room. And when you enlarge the room, when you become the person who makes space rather than takes space, people will begin to move towards you without knowing why. Every morning or night, you're just going to rate yourself on the four tangible aspects that are the precursors to composure. So you're going to look at confidence, then look at gratitude, and then we look at our relationship with time, and then environment. You're not going to overthink it. You're just going to give it a number, and whatever the first honest answer that comes out of your head is probably the right one. Then for each score, all you got to do is ask yourself basically three questions. What behavior can I start doing that would improve the score? What behavior can I stop doing? And what relationship in my life or relationships need to be edited, modified, or when real honesty with ourselves demands it, being willing to release those relationships that do not serve us. Your brain is extraordinarily good at pattern recognition. The only thing it needs is accurate data to be able to work with. So if you can give it accurate data and stop basically lying to yourself in the small ways that feel comfortable, that is the only thing this tool requires. And you will start changing in deeply profound ways much quicker than you probably realize. The next thing, when we already talked about this as a concept, but we're going to look at basically having a practice that properly sizes you and the universe. So the ego dissolution, a kind of felt sense of your connection to something larger than yourself. There's the genuine internalization that you are not the center of the universe. These are not just the things that can be fully accessed through intellectual understanding alone. These aspects need to be felt. From what I've seen, the practices that most reliably generate that felt experience are the ones that put you inside of something so large that your ego simply cannot maintain the scale that it was trying to before. Looking at a night sky in a place that's so far from city lights that the Milky Way is actually visible. If you've ever experienced this, you know this. These experiences, they don't shrink you. What they fundamentally do is they properly size you. They give the ego an accurate reference point, and they remind you that a squirrel does not care how much money you make. And once we give the ego an accurate reference point like that, it has to stop overreaching. And once it stops overreaching, composure really starts to become possible. It starts to become a natural conclusion of that. Most of us move through the world something like an automatic reaction cycle. They have an internal reaction that fires to how they feel about that event. Then they take an action, and then at the end, we get regret or some kind of felt relief. And the problem with this cycle is that it happens so quick and there's no space. What composure practice is going to do is start to give you space in that cycle. It'll just start to become part of your natural process. If you look at the people in your life, the ones you genuinely respect, the ones whose presence you find most of them share one quality above all the others. And I'd be willing to bet it's not how smart they are. It's not the incredible things they've achieved. Very likely it is their real honesty, They're not performing for you. They are simply, completely, and sometimes kind of uncomfortably themselves. But that's why we really love them and why we appreciate them so much. And that is composure. It's not the management of appearances, it's the dissolution of the need to manage them. And the reason most people never fully get there, it's honesty about who they actually are when no one is watching. Because as Chase has said, who you are when no one is watching is who you actually are. And the gap between that person and the person that you decide to present to the world is the measure of your composure deficit. Some of you are probably posturing every day, and it's not because you're bad people, because some version of the performance got you to this place that you've achieved in your life. It got you the result, got you the approval that you needed in that moment. And some of you are collapsing almost every day. And it's not because that you're weak. It's because at some point, collapse very likely kept you safe. Both of these patterns, it doesn't matter which one you fall into, they made sense when they formed. All that composure demands is that you see them clearly, without flinching and without making them more than they are. Because what they are is the old programs running on outdated information. It's a story as old as time. They were written for a version of your life that just happens to no longer exist anymore. So the question I want to leave you with, what would it cost you right now to simply stop? Not stop trying, not stop working. All you have to do is just stop performing. Stop inflating, stop shrinking, stop trying to manage what the room thinks of you because you can't control it anyways. Stop needing the world to correctly evaluate the version of yourself that you're presenting because they can't. And just be the version of yourself that doesn't need evaluation. So sit with that. I want it to be a genuine confrontation with the false version of yourself. And I also want to leave you with something that I wrote today. Composure is a reflection of truth, reconciliation, and honesty within and outside of ourselves. The composed person seeks only to represent the universe as it is, without fear, judgment, vice, or the objective, but only our ability to see and treat things simply as they are. That is the standard. It's not perfection. It has nothing to do with immaturity from fear or some kind of confusion or even the temptation to posture collapse. But a true aspiration doesn't fight its falling. It doesn't try to inflate. It doesn't shrink. It simply becomes what it always was in the process of becoming and releases with grace, being grateful for the ground that made it possible. You are here right now. The ground made you possible. And the rest of your life, every single interaction, every high stakes moment, every even quiet Tuesday morning is an opportunity to move through it the exact same way that that olive fell, with composure, with honesty, and with the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you are exactly enough and that you have absolutely nothing to prove. Thank you.